Doctor, will you state your name and spell your name for the record?
Richard Tovar, Tovar.
And what is your occupation?
I'm an emergency physician and medical toxicologist practicing in Wisconsin.
Can you please tell the jury what training you've had in order to become an emergency room physician and toxicologist?
In order to do that, you got to go to med school, and then I did my residency and training in both emergency medicine and medical toxicology at the Medical College of Wisconsin in Milwaukee, and I've been here practicing for over 30 years.
Thank you. Doctor, I'm showing you what's been marked as exhibit number 694. Can you please tell us what that is?
This is my CV or resume.
Thank you. Judge, I would move exhibit number 694 into evidence.
Any objection?
No, Your Honor.
All right. Exhibit 694 will be received.
Can you tell us where you have been employed, your various places you've been employed as an emergency room physician?
You bet. Residency is a form of employment, so that was my first real job in Wisconsin. And then
Where did you do your residency?
at the Medical College of Wisconsin in Milwaukee.
Okay.
At that time, it was the only emergency medicine residency. And then after I left, I graduated, and I did a year in a level 1 trauma center in El Paso, and then came back to Wisconsin and been back ever since, working at different size emergency departments, anywhere from smaller ones to very, very big ones. I work for a company that works from northern Wisconsin all the way down in Illinois, so I help out with all those contracts.
And in your employment in these various emergency rooms, have you dealt with many wounds that are commonly known as sharp force injuries?
Yes, it's a common occurrence to see cuts or open skin areas, or even lighter stuff like abrasions, which are commonly seen day to day in the emergency department.
Have you done some teaching in the medical area as well?
Yes, basically when the term physician means in Latin means teacher, so I've taught anywhere from residents all the way to EMS personnel and law enforcement.
How are you an assistant clinical professor at the Medical College of Wisconsin?
Yes, I am.
How long have you done that?
Since I graduated from residency, I go back and do lectures there. I teach advanced trauma life support. And so I'm still intimately involved with my residency program.
And in addition to your work as an emergency room physician, have you ever worked as a law enforcement officer?
I was a sworn police officer in the city of New Berlin for 16 years.
Why did you, was that at the same time that you were an emergency room physician?
Yes, it was.
Why did you stop being a law enforcement officer?
I got old and had to retire.
Okay, doctor. As part of your work specifically for a law enforcement officer, have you done training for law enforcement officers at all regarding the use of knives in fighting?
That's a common law enforcement training scenario is dealing with people with knives or sharp objects. And I've been asked to talk about, the damage that knives can do, how quickly people can injure you as a police officer or as just a regular citizen. So, and we did have training on recognizing sharp force potential problems.
Did some of that training include live simulation of knife fighting?
Yeah, at the time we had these marking cartridges. They had pink or yellow type ink that you would get all over yourself, and you could actually see what happened when you got marked.
Okay. but not really drawing actual blades that would cut the skin.
No.
Okay. So the other thing I want to ask you, doctor, is do you have any specialty certifications?
Right. The other one is medical toxicology. It's what we call a subboard. It's additional training in the treatment and evaluation of anywhere from babies all the way to seasoned citizens. And we also basically do a lot of work with those who are deceased in hospitals.
And when you say medical toxicology, does that mean you're looking at what substances, whether lawful or unlawful, have been ingested to a patient that could affect their health or be part of a cause of death?
Exactly. Anything can be a poison, even too much water. So we're consulted by emergency physicians, pediatricians, primary care providers to basically assist in the treatment and evaluation of these folks, and especially in the emergency department.
Can you tell us about your board certifications?
So I'm board certified in emergency medicine and medical toxicology. We have to take a test every year online to show we read so many articles pertaining to our board certification. Then we take the big one every 10 years for both.
And so that's for both the medical toxicology and emergency room?
That's correct.
Okay. And do you have any other certificates for other areas that you are qualified in, as
Well,
outlined on your curriculum vitae?
Yeah, I was a certified law enforcement officer, but now I'm retired. And nothing else that is pertaining to my usual everyday practice.
Okay. Doctor, do you belong to any professional societies?
I would belong to several, the American College of Emergency Physicians being the main one, and the American College of Medical Toxicology. Those are, besides certifying bodies, they're teaching bodies, and they keep you updated online now and at meetings also.
Have you also been awarded grants for any medical studies?
Yeah, definitely. I've been awarded grants, usually in the toxicology field, for medications that are antidotes, for example, and studying those types of things.
Have you published any articles?
Yes.
And do you know what areas they're in?
They're mostly emergency medicine and medical toxicology. Some are forensic, like law enforcement articles, too.
Okay. Have you testified previously in court?
Yes.
Okay, as far as being called as a witness in court, have you been called as a witness in criminal cases for both the prosecution and the defense?
Yes.
And would you say it's leaning much more heavily to one side or the other, or is it fairly close?
They're fairly close. It just depends on the year and who I talk to.
Okay, what about civil cases? Have you also been called as a witness in civil cases or consulted with lawyers in the civil bar?
Yes.
And again, plaintiff versus defense, has it been both or is it?
It's been both. Lately, the last few years, it's been more defense. But again, it just varies.
By defense in civil cases, do you mean firms that represent insurance companies?
Exactly.
Okay. Now, do you also receive phone calls frequently from lawyers, both prosecutors and defense lawyers, who just have quick questions for you?
Yes.
How often does that happen?
Oh, it happens at least weekly. I'll get a call from an attorney that I've done work for or did some time with in the past, and it'll be a quick question, and it's a free thing because they're just wanting to know if they should pursue certain avenues.
And is there one prosecutor's office in particular that has relied more than others on contacting you?
You know, it varies. Several years ago, it was the Waukesha County Prosecutor's Office, but that's fallen by the wayside due to their turnover. So it's not consistent right now.
And Doctor, in terms of your work here, did you review materials in the case of State of Wisconsin versus Ezra McCandless?
I did.
And did you note materials that you reported, that you reviewed in a report?
Yes.
Okay. Yes.
Okay.
Doctor, I'm showing you a couple of summary reports or memorandums that you wrote in this particular case. First, I'm going to show you exhibit number 695, and can you tell the jury what that is?
So what this is a report after reviewing certain materials such as the criminal complaint and the law enforcement reports and the autopsy reports and then the digital photographs.
What's the date of that report?
February 14th, 2019.
Did you write a second report or supplement your first report that's shown in exhibit 696?
Yes.
What's the date of that report?
March 12th, 2019.
And why did you write a second report? It's really a memorandum.
Right. The reason you write a second memorandum is because there's other information that comes to light that may or may not affect my opinion.
Okay. And is it because in this particular case you were asked to answer another question?
Yes.
All right. I would move in exhibit numbers 694 and 695.
No objection, Your Honor.
Was it 690?
I'm sorry, that's 695 and 696. My apologies, Your Honor.
Okay, and no
Still
objection.
no objection.
All right, court will receive exhibits 695 and 696.
Doctor, can you please tell the jury what materials you reviewed in connection with the case of State of Wisconsin versus Ezra McCandless?
You bet. So the criminal complaint, those are the charges, against Ms. McCandless, the Dunn County Sheriff's Office reports, the Eau Claire Police Department reports, Wisconsin State Patrol, the autopsy reports, the digital photographs for both McCandless and Woodworth, and then there were some autopsy reports because the first digital photographs were from law enforcement. The second ones were from the pathologist at the autopsy.
Thank you. Did you also review photographs of Ezra McCandless that were on medical records from the Mayo Clinic in Eau Claire, Wisconsin?
Yes.
Did you also review photographs of Ezra McCandless taken by Deputy Merriweather?
Yes.
Thank you.
For the record, I believe it's Mary Field.
Merrifield, oh, I'm sorry, I keep making that mistake. I don't know why I want to do that.
Okay, well, I do believe it is Merrifield.
You are absolutely right. And Doctor, I just want to get something out of the way here. Are you being paid for your time in this case?
Yes, I'm being paid for my time.
Is that any kind of incentive for you to not be truthful or accurate?
No.
Are there times when you're hired by a lawyer and give that lawyer an adverse opinion?
It's the majority of the time.
And in those circumstances, would it be fair to say the lawyer doesn't usually call you as a witness?
That is correct.
Okay. So I'm going to now start asking you about some of your experience with knife wounds that you've seen in your capacity as an emergency room physician. How often have you seen knife wounds?
Well, it occurs on a regular basis. First off, we see sharp force injuries, but then that's separated down into knife wounds, and unfortunately, they're just a part of everyday life in a community emergency department. You see a lot of, some days you see a lot of it, and you're doing a lot of suturing, a lot of stitching.
Have you had the opportunity then to see wounds, first of all, wounds that you've come to learn are inflicted by another person?
Yes.
And what about self-inflicted wounds?
Those also, yes.
When you're determining a wound or trying to figure out how to treat a patient, how important is it to get a history from the patient about what happened?
One of the ways we make diagnosis in medicine is we get a history, and then we do an exam, and then we formulate a plan and a diagnosis. So history is fairly important.
Are there patients who are unable to give you a medical history?
Yes.
And what do you do when a patient cannot give you his history? How do you make a diagnosis?
Well, there are patients, not just in sharp force injuries, but for example, overdoses that'll come in altered. And what you do for all of those is you rely more on your physical exam, and then you try to get other information from other fact witnesses, such as law enforcement or family members.
Okay, when you're talking about overdosed, I assume you're referring to people who've taken drugs like opiates or things like that.
That are unresponsive.
And
yeah.
you reviewed the toxicology in Ms. McCandless's report,
Yes,
and you're aware that she did not have any substances?
that is correct. There were none.
Okay. When you're asked, a patient can't give you a history and you've made a diagnosis and later more facts come to light, is it appropriate to revise a diagnosis ever?
Yes, medicine is dynamic, and so we use the word like consistent with. It looks like it could be a knife wound. It looks like it could be heart failure, and sometimes we get different knowledge that helps us pin it down and further refine it. We do an addendum. We actually put down in the patient's chart that new information has come to light.
And if a lawyer, for example, asks you to look at matters and revise an opinion, are you able to do that as well?
Yes,
Or not to revise an opinion, but to put additional information in a medical chart?
yes,
And would it be normal to do that once a patient has left the hospital or left your care?
yes,
Let me ask specifically, you've examined the cuts to Ezra McCandless. So did you specifically examined them on March, the photos that were taken by the SANE nurse, photos taken on March 22nd?
right. I actually looked at the photos and evaluated the photos. I didn't do an actual physical exam.
Correct. And you also, I believe, examined photos that were taken 3 days later by, I know I'm trying to think if it's an investigator deputy. Yes, I'm trying to get it right, Judge, by Ms. Merrifield?
Yes,
Okay. And is it fair to say that there were some changes in what you saw in those pictures?
well, again, medicine is dynamic, so wounds heal. So there's a change.
Okay. I'm going to ask you specifically on bruising. Were you able to see actual bruising on the, let me strike that, I'm sorry. Were some of the injuries that you observed to, sharp force injuries to Ms. McCandless's leg, her right leg?
Yes,
And on the original pictures taken by the SANE nurse, were you able to observe bruising on those?
they did have bruising on those, yes.
Was the bruising more visible in the pictures that were taken a few days later?
Yeah, just like bruises, they get a little bit bigger, yes.
Okay, so it's hard to observe. Is it fair to say that bruises are not always immediately observable to a camera or the naked eye?
Yeah, and it depends. It depends on your skin color, your how old you are, if you're on any other kinds of medications. So again, it's dynamic, and there are a lot of folks that where bruising is initially not seen as well as it is days later.
Doctor, are you familiar with injuries? Have you seen people come into injuries in the emergency room that are the result of sexual activity?
Yes.
And can you tell us about that?
Well, it ranges all kinds of different things. People will use different objects. They'll use their fists, and they'll even use sharp objects to be part of a sexual experience.
And have you ever seen knife wounds or sharp force injuries from sexual practices in your work in the emergency room?
Yes.
Has that become more common over time?
Unfortunately, we didn't see it a lot many years ago. It's becoming much more common.
Now, asking you some questions about the cuts to Ezra McCandless's body. First of all, would it help refresh your recollection if I showed you some photographs from the SANE nurse?
Yes, please.
All right. Doctor, I'm going to ask you some questions about the photographs that are in Exhibit 174. These photographs have been previously admitted into evidence and shown to the jury, so we're not going to actually show them again, because I think everyone's sick of looking at them, but I need to show them to you. And we're also looking for some additional photos that I'm going to ask you about as well. But would it be fair, looking at what's at the bottom is called DOJ 1127 and DOJ 1128, can you just tell the jury what you see in those two photographs?
Yes, I see several cuts, abrasions, and bruising to genital area, or we call it pubic area of Ms. McCandless.
Do some people call that the pubis mons?
The mons pubis is...
Or mons pubis, I'm sorry.
That's all right. Mons pubis is part of the vagina, and it's blacked out on this photo, but there's a lot more in the groin area.
Okay. Are you able to observe cuts to the inner thigh or groin area of Ms. McCandless?
Yes.
Are there cuts that go in both directions? In other words, are some of the cuts perpendicular to each other?
There's some that are, yeah, they're at right angles or perpendicular to each other.
All right. Turning to page with DOJ 1136, or do you, actually, I don't know what order you have them in your book. Just what's the number on the next page?
So the next one is 1128, and then it goes 1129.
Okay, and what are the photographs that you see on number 1128 and 1129?
1128 appears to be the same as the first one we were talking about in the pubic area,
Okay,
and the second one is the hands.
all right, and would that be the exterior of the hands?
Yeah, we call it the dorsal or the top part of the hands, both right and left hand.
Then turning to number 1130 and 1131, what are those photographs of?
So these are the pictures of the palm side of the hand. The dorsal side, you think of a shark like a dorsal fin, and the palmar side is this side. So we can see both hands there, both in 1130 and 1131.
And Judge, I'd ask the record to reflect that the doctor put up the palm of his right hand when he was referring to the palm.
All right, I think that's accurate. The record will so reflect.
And turning to the next two pages, DOJ 1132 and 1133, what are those photographs of?
These are photographs of what appears to be a forearm. There's an IV in it, and you've got a couple of cuts. Again, on the, this is called the volar side, or the side where the elbow is, right in the, this side. The dorsal, remember, is the dorsal fin that goes on the back, but the front part is the volar side, and these, there appears to be cuts on this side.
And I'm going to ask you next, it's not in the same order in the book, but to look at DOJ 1134 and 1137. I'll get to her neck and face later. But, so I want to look at 1134, also 1135, 1137, and 1136. I'm sorry I didn't give you those in exact order. What are you seeing in those pictures?
So 1134 is again more cuts to the inner thigh. 1135, again, more cuts to the inner thigh, same area appears to be. I'm looking for 1136.
I think it's loose in the back of the book.
Yeah. Let me just take a look here.
Yeah, you got to look on both sides. If you don't see it in
I don't have 1136. I do have 1137, what appears to be a lower extremity.
Okay, I may have misspoken. Let me just take a look. Yes, do you, I'm going to show you. Okay, I don't know if you have that in your book, but do you have 1136?
I do.
It should be on the back side of 1135.
Okay, I do.
Okay, very good. Now, I will get to the injuries on the face and the neck later, but these are basically, and there's lots and lots of other pictures, but you reviewed many more photographs than this, is that fair
Yes.
to say? All right. Looking at these injuries, are you able to determine from looking at any of these injuries how they occurred?
All you can state is they occurred with a sharp object.
Are they consistent with being inflicted on Ms. McCandless's body by another human being?
Yes.
How are you able to say that?
The word consistent means it looks like or similar to. So with my training and experience, basically, it's a sharp object. And we talked about getting the history before. So the history may be there, it may not be there, but if it's not there, it can be consistent with somebody being struck with a sharp object to cause the problems. But there are other potential causes of how it happened with respect to a sharp object.
And Can they also be consistent with being self-inflicted?
Yes.
And why do you say that?
Again, because in my medical opinion, the wounds look, the body only reacts to sharp objects the same way. Basically, how it happened, the body doesn't care. It just knows that it was cut. So it reacts with bruising, it reacts with bleeding, it reacts with opening of the skin, those types of things.
Some of these lines are parallel and some of them are not parallel. Does that tend to make your medical opinion either less likely or more likely as to whether or not they're self-inflicted or inflicted by another person?
Yeah. When you have either a self-infliction or somebody trying to get out of the way of the knife that they perceive they're being stabbed, medicine is dynamic. So your body turns and twists and tries to get away from a knife when somebody's trying to do it to you. On the other hand, when it's self-inflicted, I've asked patients over the years, it hurts. They don't stay still, they move. Some may stay still for a couple of strokes, some may stay still for all of them, but it's a wide range of how people react when they're self-inflicted, so you can see different angles of these cuts.
And is that also true if somebody is, for example, very afraid while being cut with a knife and does not move? Can one get injuries such as these when they are being cut by another person but not moving?
Correct. I mean, again, it's dynamic. People can think that they're not going to be hurt, and then they might be moving when they realize I made the wrong choice to be in this situation.
And as far as the wound to the dorsal side of the arm, does that look like the letters possibly boy?
Initially, I thought it said box, but it does. It can be boy also on the dorsal part. You bet.
And if somebody states that they self-inflicted that wound, that would be consistent with the wound, correct?
Yes.
Is it possible that wound could also be inflicted by another person?
Yes.
And so just the wound itself is not something you can tell from, correct?
Right. All you know is that it says boy and it's a cut.
All right. So would it, in making a medical diagnosis, are the statements of the person who suffered those wounds important?
Yes.
Right. Sometimes, is it fair to say people don't always give all of the information to the emergency room doctor?
Yes.
Have you ever seen patients who've been so traumatized they're literally not able to relate, even though they're conscious and awake, they are not able to relate what has occurred to them?
Yes.
How frequently does that occur?
Well, when there's some potential loss of life or some large trauma, it's unfortunately quite common. We know that people remember things differently days later. So initially, it's not that they are not hiding it from you. Sometimes they just don't remember, and then later it comes to light.
Okay. I'm going to ask you now some questions about a couple of the other photographs of Ms. McCandless's injuries that we have not seen. And I'm going to direct your attention particularly to, in that packet, to DOJ 1140, 1139, and 1141.
Got them right here.
And are you able, I'm also going to show you, while you're looking at a couple of other exhibits in particular, and they're kind of blown up versions, and that would be number 635, exhibit 635, and exhibit 636. Is it fair to say that those are close-ups of the photos that you're seeing in 1140, 1141?
Yes.
Okay. Now, with respect to Ms. McCandless's lip area I'm sorry, I forgot which one shows the lips.
Yeah, they all do, but the close-ups you gave me are the...
Yeah, in the close-up, what's the number on that one with her lips?
Let's see. Well, I just have...
The one that's straightforward, where she's holding a number.
Yeah, you go.
Okay.
There's no DOJ number, but there is a...
There's an exhibit number on that.
636.
Are you able to see some cuts to her lips on that?
I see abrasions and what looks like a cut on the outside of her right lower lip.
Okay, and do you also see something that looks like it may have been some kind of injury to her left chin area.
Yes.
And with respect to the picture on the side, to the side of her neck, a red mark, it's shown, the smaller version's 1141, and then the larger version, I think, is it's the numbers on the back.
It's the Exhibit 635.
Yes, and what do you see on that particular?
So what you see is a linear red streak. They actually, in one picture, they actually measured it. It looks like it's a little bit over 7 centimeters. They didn't do the width, but I would say, from photos, you really can't guess width. But, so she's got a linear red mark. It could be a contusion or bruise. It could be basically just an area of irritation, like a rash. So in medicine, we call it a differential diagnosis. There's certain things it could be, and so on my list is those two I just said.
And the mark to her neck, is it consistent with a bruise, contusion?
Yeah, bruises are contusion, so it is consistent with that.
What about temporary pressure being placed on the neck? Is it consistent with that?
Yes.
In your opinion, in your medical opinion, could it be consistent with being strangled by somebody?
Yeah, it could be what we call in medicine a ligature mark. Basically, ligature being like a rope or anything that could be used to cause pressure.
And what about the injuries to the lips, the cuts that you see to the lips? What are those consistent with?
Well, they're consistent with some type of sharp force causing the injuries to the lips.
And are you able to medically determine, just from looking at these photographs, what caused these injuries? The injuries to the lips and the neck?
Other than stating it was probably a blunt force, if we're calling it a contusion, or a sharp force for the lips, that's all you can say.
Doctor, what are defensive wounds?
So defensive wounds are wounds that people have. They're actually cuts or bruises or blunt injuries that people sustain when they're trying not to get injured from being hit by a blunt object or by a sharp object.
And do defensive wounds, are they usually found in a particular area of the body?
The most common area is the hands, but anything you can use. I've seen people use their heads and use their feet to try to ward off injury.
Do defensive wounds to a person's hand always have to be deep?
No.
Have you ever seen in your medical practice defensive wounds that are very shallow or superficial?
Yes.
How common is that?
Well, I don't know, but I've seen it. I wouldn't be able to tell you how common a deep wound is versus a superficial wound because that's something we just don't keep track of as doctors.
I'm showing you what's been previously marked and moved into evidence as exhibit number 638. Is that an enlargement or blow up of the hand wounds that you saw in exhibit 174?
Yes.
And looking at the wounds on the palmar side of the hand, are those consistent with defensive wounds?
Yes.
Why is that?
Again, when there is a application of force that's going to be painful, such as a sharp injury, it's dynamic. You can be grabbing all kinds of different ways or pushing all kinds of different ways to get that noxious force, that sharp object away from you. So there's a lot of, it's just all dynamic, and that's all I can tell you.
You reviewed statements that Ms. McCandless made to a member of the Eau Claire Police Department, Detective Prock,
Yes.
and you're aware that at first she was not forthcoming with information to Detective Prock, but eventually did tell him about an attack that she suffered at the hands of Alex Woodworth, correct?
Yes.
And are her statements that you heard to Detective Prock consistent with the injuries that you have observed in all of these exhibits I have shown you so far?
Objection, Your Honor.
And what's the basis of the objection?
Hazeltine, Your Honor.
I can come to sidebar if you need it. This is Jensen evidence, not Hazeltine evidence.
All right, let's do a sidebar. Objection is overruled.
I believe what I was asking you was that I believe I clarified that you have listened to or reviewed a transcript of the statements by Ms. McCandless to Detective Brock, correct?
Yes.
What I'm asking you is that all the injuries that you saw, are they consistent with her description of being attacked by another person?
Yes.
Okay. And so they're consistent either way, being attacked by another person or being self-inflicted. You can't medically tell that, right?
That is correct.
And is it fair to say there is no doctor on earth who can medically tell that?
Objection.
Well, I'm going to sustain that.
Judge, can we approach?
All right.
Okay, thanks. I'm going to rephrase my question. It was a little dramatic. Is it fair to say that it is not consistent with medical standards and medical practice to make an absolute determination by a physician that these wounds are self-inflicted based on looking at the wounds themselves?
Objection.
I'm going to overrule the objection on that. You can answer that question.
I'm sorry, but would you repeat it again?
I think I'm going to have to ask the reporter to do
Yeah.
it.
Question. Is it fair to say it's not consistent with medical standards and medical practice to make an absolute determination by a physician that these wounds are self-inflicted based on looking at the wounds themselves?
Yes. With respect to my training and experience, consistent means what it means. I've seen these wounds in self-inflicted wounds, and I've seen them with people that got into knife fights. So I don't know, with respect to my 30 years of training and experience, if there's anybody out there or any piece of medical literature that states absolutely 100%, it's one or the other. It is what it is in medicine, right? There's only death and taxes that are certain, and everything else we give patients. Basically, this is what I think you got. Your symptoms are consistent with this kind of disease process, and if you ask me at the bedside, are you absolutely certain? I'd have to say no. I can't lie to you, but but your symptoms are that they're consistent.
Thank you. I'm going to turn now to another subject. Did you review autopsy photographs taken by the Ramsey County Medical Examiner's Office of the autopsy of Alexander Woodworth?
Yes.
Okay. Now, are you a forensic pathologist?
No.
But do you see similar wounds to what you saw in the autopsy photographs in your line of work as an emergency doctor?
Yes.
And can you explain the difference to all of us about what you see that's similar in your line of work and why there's some overlapping between what you do and forensic pathologists?
There really is. What I could see similar wounds, such as the decedent's wounds, that these folks, they actually live. They make it out of the emergency department, they get admitted to the hospital, and they don't die of similar consistent wounds, such as seen by the decedent. Sometimes they'll make it to the hospital, but won't make it out of the hospital. And we take care of those people on a regular basis, unfortunately. So these wounds can be seen overlapping. People can live, people can die later. So that's where the overlap is.
And do you have an opinion as to whether or not the wounds received by Alex Woodworth that you saw in the autopsy photos were consistent with being caused by another person?
Yes, they were consistent with being caused by another person.
Are some of the wounds also consistent with the person who wielded that force acting in self-defense?
Yes.
And can the wounds also that you've seen, for that matter, without having other information, could some of the wounds to Mr. Woodworth be self-inflicted?
Yes.
Now, I'm I'm going to ask you some particular questions about the injuries to the lungs that you saw in this particular case, all right? Can you tell the jury what a hemothorax is?
A hemothorax is blood in your chest wall cavity. Our chest is a big old cavity, and basically the lungs expand and retract, and sometimes when they fill with blood, you get into trouble and can't expand your lungs or bleed internally to death.
All right. And did you observe a hemothorax in the lungs of pictures of Alex Woodworth?
Yeah, my examination of the pictures and reviewing the autopsy report said there wasn't a hemothorax.
Okay, so there was not a hemothorax, right?
Correct.
And let me ask you about how long it takes a hemothorax to develop in a person's lungs, or in the chest cavity, rather. How long does it take if somebody is injured by a sharp force injury in the lungs? How long does it take a hemothorax to develop?
I'm going to give you a typical doctor answer. It depends. It depends. In trauma, we call it location, location, location. So if you hit an artery, then it's pretty quick. If you don't hit an artery and just hit the lung, it could take a much longer time. So when people ask me this question, Doc, how long does it take? I'd say minutes to hours. That's the range.
And in this particular case, were there any injuries to any major arteries in Mr. Woodworth's lungs?
Not that were documented by the autopsy.
Is it fair to say that in the photos you saw, it was smaller vessels that had been injured?
Yes.
Okay. Now, the wounds taken as a whole, all of the wounds that you saw to Mr. Woodworth, how long, in your opinion, or do you have an opinion about how long Mr. Woodworth, it would take for Mr. Woodworth to die of these wounds?
I don't have opinion on that.
Why is that?
Because with respect to my training and my review of the literature and my experience, it's just all over the board, and I don't have enough information to make that call in this case.
Would he be able to live for some time?
That's certainly possible.
And can you say how long, like how many minutes, how many hours?
I can't.
Okay. Would he be able to speak?
One of the things that'll keep you from speaking, obviously, is an injury to your voice box or larynx. I didn't see that on the autopsy report, so he would be able to speak through his voice box if he had the opportunity to do so.
What about walk around?
Again, I don't know how painful the injuries were, how rapid an onset, and how incapacitating they were, so I can't give you an answer on that.
So, let me just say this. Have you seen scene photographs from this case at all?
Yes.
And is it fair to say that what you saw was a significant amount of blood both outside a vehicle and inside the vehicle where Mr. Woodworth was found?
Yes, there was blood there.
And assuming hypothetically that Mr. Woodworth was outside the vehicle at the time he received his last wound, would it be medically possible for him to, at some later period of time, go into the car, lie down?
Certainly.
Would it be medically possible for him to take his shoes off?
Certainly.
Would it be medically possible for him to take his coat off?
Yes.
Would it be medically possible for him to wrap a scarf around his neck wound?
Yes.
Have you seen many patients who wrap scarves or clothing or other objects around a wound to try and stem bleeding?
Yes.
And you noticed there were a lack of defensive wounds to Alex Woodworth?
I didn't see anything that looked like the wounds we were looking at on Miss McCandless.
Did you see a small wound to his finger, the exterior of one of his fingers?
Yes.
And you opine that's not a defensive wound. Why did you say that?
Again, all it looked like to me was a small cut. So what I thought was that it was done during the application of force. That's not an area that I usually see people trying to hurt themselves or commit suicide. I think most people know that the finger you won't bleed to death with. It's going to other places where there's vessels that you want to bleed out.
But not speaking of suicide, but can you tell if that wound, the small scratch that you saw to his finger, was consistent with having occurred at another time, or could, at the same time as the other injuries, or could it have occurred at another time from the
Right.
pictures you saw?
Just looking at the picture, it could have occurred at any time before his death. So that, you can't age it from a photo.
And is it fair to say that was not at all significant, that wound, in your analysis?
Medically significant, it was not. Yeah.
That's what I meant, medically sick. Everything I'm asking about is
Correct.
medical. Okay, and are all of your opinions to a reasonable degree of medical certainty?
Yes.
I don't have any further questions.
All right, and Mr. DeFore, are you going to do the cross?
Yes, I want to start out with one thing, and I just want to be sure, before we start out, I want to be sure we're all on the same page. You actually wrote out 3 different documents for this case, correct?
Objection, Your Honor, that's 2, I believe, or, well, no, there's 2 exhibits.
I got
I'm sorry.
3, so I just want to be sure that I'm correct.
Yeah, the third one, Mr. DeFore, as you well know, is the listing of all the injuries.
Okay,
That was like an appendix or an addendum.
okay, that's fine. I just want to be sure. The 2 that we're talking about are 695 and 696 contain your opinions, correct?
Yes, sir.
All right, thank you. And I want to be absolutely sure that we're all on the same page on what you reviewed. You list on 695 and 696 a number of items that you reviewed. Is that correct?
Yes.
All right. And just so that it's clear, you indicate on those reports that on both 695 and 696 that you reviewed the criminal complaint, correct?
Correct.
All right. You reviewed Dunn County Sheriff's Office incident reports, correct?
Yes.
Were those, do you know how many or what exactly for Dunn County incident reports you reviewed?
What I asked for, but is basically anything that,
Yeah, I didn't ask you what you asked for. I just asked, do you know what you actually reviewed?
what I recall reviewing was anything that was incidental to this, to the McCandless case.
Basically what defense attorneys sent you.
That is correct.
Okay. And you say you reviewed Eau Claire Police Department incident reports, correct?
Yes,
All right. And again, those were the ones that the defense counsel sent to you.
yes.
All right. State Patrol reports, did you review the State Patrol diagrams completed by Trooper DeVries?
Not that I recall.
Okay. So you didn't get those reports?
I don't recall getting those reports.
Did you, and then it goes on, autopsy report, was that the final or the provisional autopsy report that you reviewed?
So the autopsy report was the final report.
Okay, good. Again, I'm just trying to make sure so that we're on the same page. You indicate you reviewed digital photographs for McCandless and Woodworth. Did you review all of the reports or all of the digital photographs created by the Wisconsin State Crime Lab that Brooke Laxton took?
Well, I don't recall the name, but what I reviewed was what I reviewed was the digital photographs of Miss McCandless, basically very soon after her injuries, several days after her injuries, and then the autopsy photos of Mr. Woodworth.
Did you review any of the crime scene photos?
Yes,
Okay. Were those in PDF? Was it a single PDF document or was it individual photographs, individual digital files?
individual digital files.
And for example, let's just put up, if we could, Your Honor, I'd ask to be able to publish exhibit number 77. Let's just take that one.
All right, and that's already in evidence?
It's an exhibit that has been admitted, Your Honor.
Okay, go ahead.
If we can switch to the computer here. Did you review any photographs that appeared like this that had Wisconsin State Crime Laboratory case number W18603 on the bottom of them?
I reviewed lots of photographs. That's possible. with
Okay.
respect to that one, but I reviewed so many, I can't remember
All right.
that individual one.
Okay, that's fine. I was mainly looking at the type with, these were the way that most of the crime lab photos would have come in, is with this type of designation on them. And I'm asking if you remember reviewing photographs that had that type of designation on them or not. If you don't remember, that's fine.
I don't, I've seen so many photographs,
All
I
right?
don't.
That's fine. And I understand. And you said you reviewed the photographs taken by the sane nurse,
Yes,
and you reviewed the photographs taken by Deputy Merrifield, the ones on March 24th and then the ones on March 27th.
yes,
And I think you said in direct that in addition to the items that you have listed here, the 6 items you have listed here, you also reviewed the Eau Claire Mayo Hospital records of the defendant?
yes.
All right. Is there anything else, doctor, that you reviewed?
Not that I recall.
All right, great. Good. Now I think we're on the same page and we can work together. I wanted to be clear, and again, my hearing is not always perfect. I have hearing aids, but they don't work perfectly. And the words sound similar. Was counsel, when she was asking about the lung situation, was she talking about a hemo, H-E-M-O thorax, or a pneumo, P-N-E-U-M-O thorax?
My recollection of her question was hemo, blood in the lung.
Okay. And I think your testimony was that you observed a hemo, H-E-M-O
Judge, I'm sorry. He said,
thorax.
I object. What he said was he did not observe a hemothorax.
Oh, okay, you did not observe a hemothorax.
I didn't observe it on the photos.
Okay. What you actually observed was a pneumothorax, correct?
I saw that on the photo, yes,
All
sir.
right. And that's a collapsed lung from air, correct?
From air, yeah, injuring the lung, yes, sir.
All right. Now that we got that cleared up, I just wanted to be sure about that. And we have cleared up and we're sure about what all you've reviewed. I want to talk to you about a number of areas. Let's start with the injuries that you observed to Alexander Woodworth, okay?
Yes, sir.
And those were from the autopsy photos, correct?
Yes,
All right. Now, your report states that the wounds to Alex are consistent with the defendant's story that she was acting in self-defense to stop an attack by Alex, correct? That's not your exact words, but that in essence is correct?
well, what I said was that the wounds that I observed on Mr. Woodworth were consistent with being delivered by another person.
And you added in there acting in self-defense, correct?
Yes,
All right. And you also say in your report, and this time I think I will quote you, you said they were, about the injuries to Alexander Woodworth, that they were received as a dynamic process during an attempt by McCandless to protect herself from perceived harm. It's on page 3 of your report. You
Which-
wrote
which,
that, didn't you?
I'm sorry, which exhibit number?
This would be 696.
Thank you.
I'll be referring to 696 unless I say otherwise.
yes, sir. It is exactly what you stated.
There is nothing about the wounds that you observed on the pictures of from Alex Woodworth's autopsy that tell you these were wounds inflicted by the defendant acting in self-defense, is there, doctor?
Yeah, I'm going to object. That is really misrepresenting the report. He used the word consistent with, not whether it was in fact done in self-defense.
Your Honor, this is cross-examination.
I'm going to overrule the objection. You go ahead. You can answer.
Yes, so what I thought that.
Doctor, that doesn't take anything except a simple yes or no. There is nothing about the wounds themselves that tell you these wounds were inflicted by the defendant acting in self-defense.
That is true. That's what I'm saying. Yes, sir.
Nothing about these wounds themselves by themselves that tell you they were inflicted by the defendant to protect herself from perceived harm, correct? Yes or no?
Repeat that again, sir, I'm sorry.
Sure. Nothing about these wounds themselves, just the pictures of the wounds you see that tell you they were inflicted by McCandless to protect herself from perceived harm.
Yes, sir.
There's nothing about these wounds themselves that tell you that the defendant was in danger of any kind. Is that not correct?
Yes, sir.
In fact, these wounds would be just as consistent with someone acting with homicidal rage, would they not?
There's a lot of potential for consistency. Yes, sir.
However, you do not say that in your report, do you?
Of course not. I was asked to see if they were consistent with somebody giving the wounds, somebody receiving the wounds from somebody else, or being self-inflicted. Of course, I wasn't asked that question.
Doctor, you don't say in your report that these wounds are consistent with someone acting with homicidal rage, do you?
That is correct.
Judge, I'm going to object to the word homicidal rage. That's a layperson and argumentative term. I think asking whether they're inflicted by another person who's committing a homicide or a lack of self-defense is appropriate, but not the words homicidal rage.
Yeah, I'm going to overrule. I think that can stand.
In fact, the only thing in there you state is that the wounds are consistent with the defendant acting in self-defense, correct?
Yes.
Oh, by the way, back to what you reviewed, did you review, I just want to be sure, you said you reviewed the statements of the defendant. Did you review the recordings themselves? Did you review the transcripts, or did you just review the summaries in Detective Proc's report?
My recollection is the latter. I just reviewed the law enforcement reports of Ms. McCandless' statements.
So you did not review the recordings of her statements themselves?
Correct.
And you did not review the transcripts of the statements yourself?
Correct.
Themselves? Those weren't provided to you by counsel for the defense?
Correct.
Now, I want to talk about the wound to Alex's finger. That wound could be a defensive wound, could it not?
Yes.
But in your report, you do not state that, do you?
That is correct.
In fact, in your report, you state that none of Alex's wounds appear to be defensive wounds, correct?
That is correct.
Doctor, I want you to consider this as a possibility, that the first injury to Alex was to his head, okay? The head wound, and you're familiar with that wound, correct?
Yes.
All right. A wound of that type involving a knife that goes through the skull into the brain could disorient an individual, could it not?
Yes.
All right. In fact, that would be not unlikely, correct?
Correct.
All right. And if someone is disoriented from an injury like that, they may not be able to act in self-defense. Is that not correct?
Correct.
You also reviewed the wound to the scrotal sac of Alex Woodworth, correct?
Yes.
And you would agree that wound would be quite painful, correct?
Oh, yes.
You gave that some emphasis, correct?
Yes, sir.
All right. And if that happens, an individual would be very likely to reach down into that area where that pain is. Is that not correct?
Yes.
You also reviewed the autopsy report and noted that there were a severing of both the external and a branch of the internal jugular vein of Alex Woodworth, correct?
Yes.
And you would agree that the jugular vein is a very large vein in the body, correct?
Yes.
In fact, one of the largest, is it not?
Correct.
And it carries a substantial volume of blood, correct?
Yes.
And you would agree that if you sever those, there was going to be a substantial blood loss, correct?
Yes.
And there would be substantial bleeding from those wounds, correct?
Yes.
And in fact, you reviewed the photos from the autopsy and you saw the photo of Alex Woodworth's sweater, correct?
Yes,
And there was substantial blood on that sweater, correct?
it was soaked.
All right. And there would also be additional blood that would likely be dripping down even past the sweater to the ground, correct?
Yeah, you know, you'd have to ask, I couldn't give you an opinion on that.
All right. But there was certainly substantial bleeding.
Yes,
And you also agree that the injury to the scrotal sac showed substantial bleeding as well, correct?
it showed bleeding. I don't know if I'd put the word in substantial, but it was definitely some bleeding going on.
All right. Well, you saw the underwear of Alex Woodworth,
Yes,
and the front of those underwear were pretty soaked with blood, correct?
yes,
All right. The front of the pants were pretty well soaked with blood, correct?
correct.
And you also reviewed the autopsy report as it related to the injury to the head, correct?
Yes,
And you agree that that involved significant internal hemorrhage, correct?
in the brain, yes.
All right. There was, I think Dr. Mills told us there was subarachnoid bleeding, correct?
Yes.
There was subdural bleeding, correct?
Yes,
And there was also bleeding above the dura, correct?
correct.
And you agree that if you lose a sufficient volume of blood, that will cause you to go into shock, correct?
Correct.
And when you go into shock, you'll relatively rapidly lose consciousness, won't you?
It depends on the type of shock. It depends on how fast your rate is. So there's a lot of other factors.
All right. You would also agree that most of the other wounds do not result in substantial hemorrhage, correct?
That is correct.
So would you agree that outside of the, and I'm going to talk about certain wounds, outside of the wound to the head, the 3 slice wounds to the neck that caused the severing of the jugular veins, and the wound to the scrotal sac, you would agree that the remainder of those wounds would be properly characterized as perimortem injuries, correct?
No, sir, I don't know if they occurred before or after his death. So I would tell you I don't have an opinion on that.
Okay, so they could be perimortem or they could be actually postmortem,
Yes, sir.
all right. But they're one of those two,
Yes, sir.
all right.
Yeah.
You testified on direct, and I believe it's in your report 696 again, that some of the puncture wounds are consistent with self-inflicted trauma. Could you tell us for sure which ones of the wounds you're talking about that you believe are self-inflicted or could be consistent with self-inflicted trauma?
My recollection of his wounds, he had 16 of them. Basically, in with respect to my training experience, I've seen people injure themselves with the same kind of wounds to the neck, for example. I've never seen one to the head that way, but I've seen it to the neck. So, again, consistent with, have I seen somebody who cut themselves badly on the neck and injured the jugular vein? Yes, and that was self-inflicted. The other wounds that are puncture wounds could also be consistent with a self-inflicted wound.
Okay. So just the ones, you're saying potentially the ones to the jugular vein could be consistent with self-inflicted?
Yes,
You said you reviewed the defendant's statement, correct?
yes.
At least the report of it.
The report.
And if in her statement she says, I sliced the neck of Alex Woodworth, we would agree that those are not then very likely self-inflicted, correct?
Again, are they consistent with the statement that Ms. McCandless said she sliced it? That would be consistent with it, but I couldn't rule out it was self-inflicted.
Okay.
You're asking me to give you a 100% answer.
Now, you put in your report, again, 696, that the defendant this is on page 2 of Exhibit 696, the very first line there, actually the first 2 lines, you put on there, and I'll read it. While at the hospital, McCandless stated that she was sexually assaulted by Woodward. That's what you write, correct?
Yes,
All right. You said you reviewed the hospital reports, correct?
yes.
Isn't it true, doctor, that nowhere in the hospital reports does the defendant explicitly say that she was sexually assaulted by Alexander Woodworth?
That is correct. My interpretation of this is that she said it to law enforcement, but I did not state in my report here that it was stated by anybody at the hospital. All I stated was that it was stated.
Okay. And so, then that's fine. It was to law enforcement then that you're saying that she reported that she was sexually assaulted by Alexander Woodworth.
That's my recollection of the review.
All right. You said you reviewed Detective Proc's report about the interviews of the defendant, correct?
Correct.
All right. Did you review Officer Reeves' report of his interview with the defendant?
I'd have to see the report to remember.
All right.
It was hundreds of pages I
All
reviewed.
right. Did you review Deputy Shields' report of his interview with the defendant?
Same answer.
All right. Did you review Trooper Knutsen's report of his interview with the defendant?
Same answer.
All right. Doctor, would it surprise you that in none of those reports that of the defendant's interviews at the hospital where she says that she was actually sexually assaulted by Alexander Woodworth?
Now, Judge, I'm going to object. She said she thought she was sexually assaulted at different points. And, you know, we've had all this going over of the word think. So if counsel asks a question as opposed to she thinks she was instead of she was absolutely sure, that would be an accurate statement of the evidence.
Well, Your Honor,
Okay, go ahead.
can we approach, Your Honor, on this? I
right.
think it's better to approach, so we're not arguing in front of the jury.
All right. The objection is overruled, and you may continue, Mr. Tovar.
So, Doctor, would it surprise you that in no report does she state explicitly that she was sexually assaulted by Alexander Woodworth?
If you're talking about the law reports, I support I stipulate to their veracity. I think they're correct. Stipulate to their veracity. I think they're correct.
I'm sorry.
In fact, you would agree that in her March 24th interview with Detective Proc, she specifically is asked if Alexander Woodworth was attempting to have sex with her, correct?
Yes.
And you would agree that her response was she didn't think so, correct?
At that time, yes.
Now, in your report, again, we'll stick with 696, because I think it's pretty much the same as 695. You place on page 1 of that report, this would be 5th line from the bottom of that report, you state, and I quote,
I'm sorry, what's the number again?
696.
Okay. So
And again, counsel, unless I say specifically, I'm really talking about 696.
okay, thank you very much.
Yep. So 5th line from the bottom on page 1, you state, and I quote, McCandless stated to law enforcement that Woodward had carved the word boy into her arm. Close quote. That's what you state, correct?
That is what I state. Yes, sir.
All right. And going to page 2 of that report, top of page 2, second line down, you write, McCandless stated that Woodward had held her down and carved the word boy in her arm, close quote, correct?
Yes, sir.
Doctor, when you wrote that report, you were fully aware of the interview of the defendant by Detective Proc on March 24th, correct?
Yes.
All right. And you were fully aware that in that interview on March 24th, the defendant admitted that she is the one that carved the word boy into her arm, correct?
I'm aware of that, sir. Yes, sir.
All right. You did not write that in your report, did you?
Nope.
But you do agree at this point in time, not based on opinion, not based upon anything except for the fact that the defendant admits it, that the word boy was self-inflicted into her arm, correct?
Yes.
You also state in your report that all of the defendant's injuries are consistent with being inflicted by others, correct?
Yes.
All right. You also agree, however, that they are all consistent with being self-inflicted injuries, correct?
Yes.
You don't state that in your report, do you?
That's because I was asked to see if they were consistent with an attack. Of course not.
Right. So, Doctor, you don't state in your report that your opinion is that they are all consistent with being self-inflicted injuries, yes or no?
Correct.
And I believe, Doctor, you would agree, actually, let's go back a second. You reviewed the photos of the injuries, correct?
Yes,
You never actually examined the defendant, did you?
that is correct.
All right. You never examined her injuries, correct?
Correct.
All right. Have you ever talked to the defendant?
No,
So you never talked to her either, correct?
correct.
All right. And you agree that you can't tell the depth of an injury from a photograph, correct?
That is correct.
You would agree, though, that a treating physician, a physician that's actually looking at the patient and treating that patient, would be able to tell the depth of injuries, correct?
Yes,
So you would agree that if the treating physician's opinion is that, except for the injuries to the groin, the other injuries were all of a consistent depth, you wouldn't have any reason to dispute that, would you?
no, I would not.
And you would also agree that if the treating physician, the one who actually observed these injuries on the defendant, had the opinion that the ones to the groin were shallower than the ones to the other injuries, you wouldn't have any reason to dispute that either, would you?
No, sir.
And you would agree that as a treating physician, you get more information than what you get from just the reports and from looking at photographs, correct?
Yes,
You're able to tell a lot more as a treating physician, correct?
correct.
So just so that we are absolutely 100% clear, you agree that the wounds on the left hand, on the palmar surface of the left hand, are consistent with being self-inflicted, correct?
For McCandless?
Yes.
Sir. Yes, sir.
All right. Yes, we're just, and I'm sorry, thank you for clarifying that. The ones I'm just about to ask about are all of the defendant, okay? You agree that the wounds on the right thigh of the defendant are consistent with being self-inflicted, correct?
Yes,
You agree that the wounds on the pubic area or the groin are consistent with being self-inflicted, correct?
yes,
You agree that the wound on the stomach is consistent with being self-inflicted, correct?
yes,
You agree that the wound to the lip is consistent with being self-inflicted, correct?
yes,
And you agree that what you noted on the left, I believe it's the right side of the neck, is consistent with being self-inflicted, correct?
yes,
And while we're on that, you said you observed the photographs of taken by Ms. Merrifield, and actually, we'll get to that later. I'm sorry, let me move on. You would agree that the wounds to the forearm of the defendant would result in some blood loss, correct?
yes,
All right. Not certainly of a similar caliber or similar nature to the blood loss sustained by Alexander Woodworth, correct?
Would you repeat that again, sir? I'm sorry.
Not of the same gravity as the blood loss to Alexander Woodworth, but some blood loss.
Yes,
All right. You would also agree that the wounds to the palmar surface of the left hand would also involve some blood loss, correct?
yes,
And again, not the same magnitude of blood loss as Alexander Woodworth.
yes,
And you would agree that the wounds to the right thigh would also involve some blood loss.
Yes,
All right. But again, not to the same type of magnitude as Alexander Woodworth.
yes.
Now, Doctor, why don't we, I want to photos from Merrifield. Actually, you still have Exhibit 174 up there, Doctor? Which
that
should
the-
be the, this should be 174,
Yes, sir.
correct?
Okay. Yes, sir.
All right. Can you turn to DOJ 1136 and 1137?
Yes, sir.
All right, are you there?
Yes, sir.
You would agree that on exhibits 1136, 1137, they show basically the same area, correct?
Correct.
All right. You would agree that there are areas there where there are parallel lines, correct?
Yes,
All right. And those are essentially straight lines along the, what would be the right thigh of the defendant, correct?
yes,
All right. And then there are also another set of lines that are not completely perpendicular, but somewhat at an angle to those set of parallel lines, correct?
correct.
And can you turn to 1134 and 1135? Those show, are you there? I'm sorry.
Almost there,
Dr.
sir.
When you're ready, let me know.
You bet. Thank you. I'm there.
All right. Those show two lines of injury on the, little bit higher up on the thigh, getting towards the groin area.
Yes,
All right. And while not perfectly parallel, they do have some aspects of parallelity to them, correct?
it's all subject to interpretation. These don't look parallel to me.
All right. Well, you've got one pretty much straight line, the one that's farther to the right, correct?
Yes,
All right. And then one that starts out straight and has some curve to it then towards the end, correct?
yes,
Thank you. Now, Doctor, you would agree that while someone is being cut by another person with a knife, you're not generally going to just lay there still, correct?
well, it depends on the circumstances, sir. If they're in fear for their life, there may be any number of circumstances that they would be still. I can't guarantee 100% of the time that they would not move.
All right, you reviewed again the report of the statement of the defendant from March 24th, correct?
Yes,
And in that statement, you agree that the defendant states that while she was initially still, once she started getting cut, she started to kick and move, correct?
correct.
All right. If someone is kicking and moving, Doctor, you would agree that it is extraordinarily unlikely that you will see injuries like you see on pages 1136 and 1137, correct?
Again, it's a dynamic process. It would be just mere speculation on my part.
Doctor, did you also review the reports indicating that these, let's stay with 1136 and 1137, that those are made by cutting through clothing? Do you recall that the defendant stated that to Detective Prock?
Yes,
All right. And you would agree that if someone is not only kicking and moving, but also the individual is trying to cut through clothing, it would be extraordinarily difficult for them to make straight line cuts like that, correct?
it would be difficult, yes.
And especially straight line cuts like the 2 or 3 that you see on 1135 and 1136 that are clearly parallel lines, correct?
1135 and 1136, let me get to those. Again, as I said
Oh,
before,
I'm sorry, I'm on the wrong page. I'm at 1136 and 1137.
there you go, because 1135 are not parallel.
Right.
Again, what you see is a combination of things, though. They're not exactly parallel. If I'm counting at least seven cuts And some are not, maybe two or three of them are parallel, but two of them overlap each other. So your categorization of the wound, to me, is incorrect. This is a bunch of chicken scratch.
All right, well, you've got three that are extraordinarily parallel, correct?
You got three that may be extraordinary. You got one overlapping, I think we're describing the piece of art in a different way, to tell you the truth. I don't agree to that, sir, no.
All right, that's fine. Now, in your report, you indicate that you have the opinion that the injuries to the defendant's left hand are consistent with defensive wounds, correct?
Yes,
All right. You would agree that an individual who's defending themselves, if they have the ability to, are more likely to defend with their dominant hand, correct?
that is correct.
And you agree that the defendant is right hand dominant, correct?
Yes,
You would also agree that if a person is going to self-inflict injuries, they will more likely use their dominant hand as the hand that they use to wield the knife to inflict those injuries, correct?
yes, sir.
And if they are then inflicting those injuries to their upper extremity, that being their arm, they are then therefore much more likely to inflict it to their non-dominant side, correct?
Correct.
And you agree that the injuries that we see here are on the defendant's non-dominant hand, correct?
Correct.
Now, in your report, although it wasn't asked about, this is on page 3, again 696, counsel, say that the injuries to the defendant were potentially lethal, correct?
Correct.
All right. Doctor, have you ever seen, now you read the medical reports, correct?
Yes,
And you read that the injuries to the groin involved not even superficial cuts or lacerations, but superficial abrasions, correct?
correct.
And an abrasion is actually something even less than a cut, correct?
Well, it's a type of cut, sir.
I'm sorry?
It's a type of cut.
All right. A less severe type of cut.
Less depth, yes, sir.
And have you ever seen in your practice, in your emergency room practice, someone suffer death from a superficial abrasion to the groin, similar to the groin injury that you see here?
No,
All right. Are you aware of any literature that indicates that someone dies from a superficial abrasion to the groin, similar to the one to the defendant here?
no,
Are you aware of any studies that indicate that a superficial abrasion of this type could be lethal?
I am not.
And you also agree, although it's not in your report, that the injury to the hand is not a potentially lethal injury, correct?
Agree, yes, sir.
And let's talk about then the injury to the thigh area. You agree again that that was, by the doctors who actually treated the defendant, defined as a superficial cut, correct?
Yes,
Have you ever seen in your years of practice as a emergency room doctor someone who has died from a superficial cut similar to the injury seen here?
I have not.
Are you aware of any literature that reports someone dying from a superficial cut to the thigh similar to the one that's seen here?
No,
And are you aware of any studies that indicate that a superficial cut to the thigh like this could be lethal?
I am not.
Now, doctor, you would agree that it is extremely important when you're writing a report for a court case, and especially a homicide case, to be accurate in your reports, correct?
Yes,
You agree it is important to include all relevant findings in your report, correct?
yes,
You agree it is extremely important to be thorough in your report, correct?
yes,
However, you do not include in your report that the defendant admitted that she self-inflicted the word boy on her left arm, correct?
That is correct.
And you do that despite the fact that you included the fact that she lied to law enforcement, not calling it a lie, but the fact that she lied to law enforcement and said that Alex Woodworth had done that to her,
Well, Judge, he's
correct?
either calling it a lie or he's not. I think if he wants to say she stated, it's confusing, so.
Okay, hold on a second.
Actually, I think counsel
Is it included in the report?
no, it's not included in the
It's
report.
the form of the question
I'll-
that I'm
Okay.
I'll
Please
rephrase.
rephrase the question.
You don't do that despite the fact that you knew that she told law enforcement that that was a lie, correct?
I don't know if I recall that she told him it was a lie. All I know is that she did state later that she did it herself.
All right.
The word lie is a legal term, sir. It's not a medical term.
All right. Well, you included it in your report despite the fact that you knew that she had self-inflicted it, correct?
That is correct.
And you didn't bother to include her admission, correct?
I didn't include her admission because at the first time I didn't know it, the second time I did. And it was definitely not part of my opinion of what could, other things that could cause the wounds.
Well, you didn't take it out of your second report.
I did not.
You also do not include in your report anywhere that all of the injuries are also consistent with being, all the injuries to the defendant are also consistent with being self-inflicted, correct?
That is correct.
Now, you also know that the victim's name in this case was Alexander Woodworth, correct?
Yes, sir.
All right. And in your report, you use the victim's name, this is report 696, a total of 17 times, correct?
If you say so, sir.
All right. And isn't it true that 9 of those times you list his name as Woodworth, correct?
If you say so, sir.
All right. Well, do you want to count them? You've got the report there, doctor.
I'm agreeing with you.
Okay, you agree that that's correct then?
Sure, certainly.
All right. And you also agree that 8 times you refer to him as Woodward, W-O-O-D-W-A-R-D, correct?
Correct.
That was not accurate, was it?
No, it wasn't.
So we've established already that you did not examine the defendant, so all you know about the defendant's injuries is what you've seen in photographs and read in reports, correct?
That is correct.
All right. And you would agree that photographs do not always capture an injury as it actually appears, correct?
That is correct.
In fact, 2 pictures of the same injury may cause it to look different depending on a variety of factors, correct?
Correct.
Right. So it could include the lighting, correct?
Yes.
Could include the angle of the picture, correct?
Yes.
Could include the focus of the picture, correct?
Yes.
Could include the depth of field of the picture, correct?
That is correct.
So if someone is using fluorescent versus incandescent light versus LED lights versus halogen lights or natural light, the same thing may look completely different, correct?
I'm not a photographer, but that makes sense to me.
All right. Because different light sources have different color temperatures, correct?
Yes.
All right. And those different color temperatures may change the color that something appears, correct?
Certainly.
So let's take a look, Doctor, and I want to show exhibit number, I think it's going to be one of the.
I'm probably going to need a couple minutes to get it.
Yeah, let's start with 320. Okay, can we display that?
320, please.
Exhibit 320.
What? Oh, you're going to put it on the screen?
Yes. Can we put 320, can you just, yeah, we've got them. All right. So this is one of the photos that you observed, correct?
Yes.
And this is the one taken by Deputy Merrifield on March 24th of 2018, correct?
I don't know, sir. I can't.
And if that's the testimony, you wouldn't doubt that, correct?
You know, I don't recall, that red mark is gone. on her neck, and she looks a lot different than she did initially. So I would say that I don't know when that picture was taken, but it
All
was
right.
taken later.
Well, and if Deputy Merrifield testified earlier in this trial that this photo was taken on March 24th, you would not have a reason to dispute that, would you?
Correct.
All right. And then let's take a look at what's in, can you look in your packet there? Do we have? We should have. All right, that's perfect. I don't know. It's fine. Can we switch the computer, please? Thank you. You would agree that her face looks substantially different in that photo taken on March 22nd than it does on March 24th, correct?
Yes.
And you would agree that the difference is not consistent with just 2 days passing, correct?
I don't understand your question, sir.
You would agree that the degree of difference between those two is not consistent with just 2 days passing. In other words, you wouldn't expect that let's start with just the acne on her face would clear up to that extent in 2 days, would you?
I would agree that it's definitely different, because it's a photo, and we've already discussed this before, and I didn't get a chance to examine the wound. I can't give you an opinion.
Okay.
They are
So-
different photos, though, sir.
All right. It could be, the reason why that appears that way could be because of the lighting, couldn't it?
Certainly.
Thank you. We can turn off now. Now, we've already established, I think, but I just want to confirm, you only actually reviewed the materials that were actually submitted to you by defense counsel, correct?
Yes.
All right. Now, Doctor, approximately how many times in the last 5 years were you hired by defense attorneys to consult on a criminal case?
I would say I average about 6 a year. Like
From
maybe
defense attorneys?
defense attorneys, I'm sorry, it's probably 60% of that. So let's say, let me just think about this. Basically hired to look at cases.
Right.
I would say probably once a month. There we go, because testifying is different. To look at cases once a month for either defense or the prosecution.
How many of those times were you hired in the last 5 years when it's once a month by a defense attorney?
I would say about 60% of the time.
And how many times by a prosecutor?
And the remainder is 40%, sir.
Okay. And how much have you been paid by defense attorneys in the last 5 years to provide opinions in criminal cases?
No, I object to the phrasing "to provide opinions" as opposed to review materials.
Mr. Tovar?
Provide opinions, Your Honor, I believe is appropriate.
All right, well, I'm going to overrule. Go ahead. It goes to, well, I'm not going to say what it goes to, but you go ahead.
Okay, Your Honor. None, sir.
You haven't been paid anything?
I've been paid to provide my time in reviewing of,
Okay. How much have you been paid to provide your time and opinions in those cases?
it just varies. I don't have an exact figure for you. I could get it for you later, but I don't know.
Well,
I really don't.
approximately.
I'm not going to guess.
All right. How much were you paid by the defense in this case to provide your report, your time and your report that you provided to the defense in this case?
In this case, sir, $1,050.
And how much are you being paid to appear here today to testify?
$1,950.
I'm sorry?
$1,950.
And your only involvement in this case was as a result of being hired by the defense to provide your input and your opinion.
Yes,
Never were a treating physician for the defendant.
correct.
Doctor, I don't need to put it back up again, but on page 1138 from exhibit 174. You said, yes, you said that could be a rash?
Yes,
All right. And you also said it could be consistent with a ligature mark, correct?
correct.
You've seen ligature marks, correct?
Yes, sir.
And those happen when somebody wraps some type of a item around someone's neck.
Yes,
Could be a cord, could be a rope, could be a lot of things, correct?
right.
All right. And you would agree that ligature marks, when someone actually puts a ligature mark around someone's neck with such force that it causes a mark on the neck, it's typically a bilateral mark, correct?
No, sir, it could be consistent. There could be many other factors. Again, it's a dynamic process. The patient can have their head turned a different way. The ligature could be inconsistent in width. The pressure could be inconsistent. So, no, sir, it's just so many factors I couldn't begin to state that.
You're
Mr.
saying
Chairman.
that it's not typically a bilateral mark?
I'm saying, sir, it all depends on the situation.
My question was not what does it depend on? My question is it typically a bilateral mark?
I can't answer your question.
Okay, fair enough. Doctor, you talked about having seen patients that come into your emergency room with similar injuries to what Alexander Woodworth suffered.
Yes,
All right. How many of them have come in with severed jugular veins?
sir, I can't give you a number, but I've seen severed jugular veins survive and die.
And how long after they suffered the severing of their jugular vein did they receive medical treatment?
Now, most of them were pretty quick, but in a short period of time.
And when you say pretty quick, short period of time, are we talking about a few minutes?
Minutes to hours.
All
I do not have any further questions for Dr. Tovar. Thank you.
right, Ms. Vishney, redirect.
Yes, I just have a few questions. Doctor, I'm sorry, I need to turn my microphone on. Doctor, have you seen sharp force injuries or knife wound injuries in the emergency room as a result of sex where the person who was cut was laying still?
Yes,
And in those cases, have some of those injuries been straight lines?
certainly.
And did you know in those cases whether or not those straight line cuts were made because cuts were through clothes or not through clothes? Do you have any idea?
Basically, it did differ. Yeah, there's sometimes we knew and sometimes we didn't know.
Doctor, as far as the wounds in this case, I think you said that you obviously don't know the depth to the extent of a treating doctor, but when you looked at the injuries to Miss McCandless, is it fair to say that you were aware they weren't terribly deep?
Oh, yes.
And why did you know that?
I reviewed the emergency department reports.
Okay, were you also able to tell that because there weren't any stitches?
Correct. There was no obvious treatment like stitches. They may have been cleaned, but
And when you said in your report that the wounds were potentially lethal, did you mean they were actually lethal?
no, potentially lethal is location. That's what I meant. That's what I said in my Daubert, Basically, they were over areas, some areas that all you need is a couple millimeters deeper and they can cause significant bleeding. So potentially that way.
Okay, but you didn't mean these wounds themselves, the pictures you saw were actually lethal at all,
That is
right?
correct. It was all about the location.
All right. You were asked about whether or not the stab wound to Alex Woodworth's head would cause disorientation. And you said, yes, it could. Would that depend on what region of the brain
Yeah.
was hit?
Again, definitely, it all depends what part of the brain and how severe the blow was and those types of things.
Are those things you're able to determine just from looking at autopsy pictures?
Absolutely not.
So is it also possible that a person could receive that wound and not be disoriented?
Yes,
You were asked a lot of questions about the jugular vein being cut. Cutting to a jugular vein is quite a bit different than cutting to an aorta, correct?
yes,
Both of these blood vessels run through the neck, is that fair?
The carotid artery runs through the neck, and yes.
Okay, and why is a cut to the jugular vein different than a cut to an aorta?
Well, first off, one's a vein and one's an artery, which means the vein has much less pressure going through the body. So you're going to bleed slower. You're going to bleed, but you're going to bleed slower. As previously stated, it's a big vein. It's not like a little vein, so you're going to bleed. But the artery, you can bleed out if you hit your carotid artery within minutes because it has a high amount of pressure.
Okay. I'm just going to ask you a question about what's been called your report. You know, there's been some attention drawn to typographical errors. Is this a formal report that you reviewed, or were these informal memos to Mr. Aaron Nelson?
It was a memo.
Okay. Were you asked to create a formal report where you would have proofread it and corrected all of these things?
No.
All right, nothing further.
All right, any recross based on that?
Just a couple things. Is this a type of report that you typically provide to defense attorneys or prosecutors?
In a memo form, yes, sir. In an official report, no, sir.
All right. But even in a memo like this, you agree it's important to be accurate, correct?
Oh, yes, sir.
Thank you. Nothing further.
Okay, thank you, Dr. Tovar.